From the moment the Colorado Supreme Court disqualified Donald Trump from the ballot a few months ago, it was obvious that their decision would be overturned. As I discussed on this show at the time, there were so many flaws with the opinion, it was difficult to know exactly where to begin. The decision ignored Donald Trump's calls for peaceful demonstration on January 6th. It accused him of speaking in violent, coded language because he was mean to some random protesters at his rallies. And then it concluded that a single Colorado bureaucrat had the power to effectively delete his entire candidacy. Now, it's not worth rehashing all the details. This was a decision that any reasonably informed person knew was going to be overturned. Now, unfortunately, what's become very clear in the past 24 hours is that a very large number of people in this country are not reasonably informed. Instead, they're told to pay attention when Rachel Maddow beams into MSNBC to tell viewers that Donald Trump might soon be barred from the ballot in multiple states. They're bombarded with junk analysis, like CNN's assessment that the legal case for kicking Trump off the ballot was strong, they claimed. And they're fed think pieces from buffoons like Harvard law professor Lawrence Tribe, who calls the Colorado Supreme Court's decision unassailable. Unassailable. And just think about that for a second, that last part, because you can get a more accurate assessment of constitutional law issues from a conservative podcast than you can from an allegedly esteemed Harvard law professor who supposedly specializes in constitutional law. With as far as Harvard has fallen in the past decade or so, that may not be very surprising, but it's worth pointing out because of the implications for the rest of the country. Millions of people listen to con artists with very fancy titles who lie to them as a matter of course. And even when these con artists are exposed, as they were yesterday, they make it very clear that they're not backing down. And we saw that again and again in the aftermath of the Supreme Court's unanimous decision yesterday, striking down the decision by the Colorado Supreme Court. I'll begin with Keith Olberman, who was so worked up in the aftermath of the Supreme Court's decision that he apparently admitted to having urine all over his face, which is not an exaggeration. Although I and everyone else who happened to be using Twitter yesterday very much wishes it were. I mean, this really happened. So here's how Keith's day began. He tweeted, quote, "The Supreme Court has betrayed democracy. Its members, including Jackson, Kagan, and Sotomayor, have proved themselves inept at reading comprehension. And collectively, the court has shown itself to be corrupt and illegitimate. It must be dissolved." So we're not packing the court anymore. We're just going to get rid of the whole thing, according to Keith Olberman. How does that work? Like, what are the implications of that? What are the repercussions? How does that, I mean, this is like a pillar of our whole system of government. Well, we're just going to get rid of it. Now, in response, someone helpfully pointed out that the Supreme Court's decision was unanimous. Here was the reply, quote, "Cry more, 9-0. And Olberman, reading this, announced, quote, "Those aren't tears, fascist. They're urine. I'm sure you enjoy being bathed in it." Now, at best, honestly, it's the worst comeback that I've ever heard in my life. I don't think I've ever heard of a worse comeback than that. And at worst, it's an admission of exactly the kind of deviant behavior you'd expect Keith Olberman would engage in all the time. Now, we can't be sure, to be fair. So Olberman seems to have admitted that he has pee on his face, but we don't know the source of the pee. So let's just be clear about that. Did he pee on his own face? Is this someone else's pee on his face? There are many details that are left obscured here, probably for the best. But we do know one way or another that Keith Olberman has pee all over his face. And as distressing as that thought may be, the truth is that Keith Olberman is not alone on the left. In response to yesterday's decision, Colorado Secretary of State Jenna Griswold, the woman who unilaterally tried to have Trump thrown off the ballot, also began attacking the Supreme Court, of course. Watch.
Do you think this court is partisan?
I think this court has had obviously some pretty big issues, whether it has been, Clarence Thomas's wife's role, gifts that have gone unreported. And there are some pretty big decisions that have come out of the court that I highly disagree with, and I think strip Americans of our basic human rights and fundamental freedoms.
Sorry, I was just distracted because I was just thinking that now that we know that the leftist tears are urine, it does, make me a little bit less excited about the leftist tears tumbler. I think we'll just put that to the side. Anyway, I wasn't paying attention to what she just said there, but just to restate how absurd all this is, the Supreme Court's decision was unanimous. It was a 9-0 vote. overturning what this Secretary of State did. And instead of grappling with the implications of that, both the interviewer and the woman with the crazy eyes, Griswold, pretend as though this was a partisan decision. That's how the question was framed. It's how Griswold responds. She goes off into some bizarre discussion about Clarence Thomas. From there, they use the exact same talking points they used back when the Dobbs decision came out. And there's a reason they're doing this that I'll get to in a moment. But for now, it's important to highlight some of the more unhinged responses to the Supreme Court's ruling, because you have to understand how truly, profoundly that Donald Trump has broken these people. When we say something is free, it should mean precisely that. No strings attached, no hidden costs, no fine print to decipher. When you switch to Pure Talk today, you'll get a free Samsung 5G smartphone. There's no 4-line requirement, no activation fees, just a free Samsung that's built to last with a rugged screen, quick charging battery, and top-tier data security. Qualifying plans start at just $35 monthly for unlimited talk, text, 15 gigs of data, and a mobile hotspot. Pure Talk gives you phenomenal coverage on America's most dependable 5G network. It's the same coverage you know and love, but for half the price of the other guys. Pure Talk saves the average family almost $1,000 a year. Plus, with Pure Talk, you know you're spending your hard-earned money with a company that aligns with your values. Let Pure Talk's expert U.S. customer service team help you make the switch today. Go to puretalk.com/Walsh to claim eligibility for your free brand new Samsung 5G smartphone and start saving on wireless today. Again, go to puretalk.com/Walsh to switch to my cell phone company, Pure Talk. So elsewhere at MSNBC, for example, a Slate columnist disclosed that he went rooting around the metadata of the Supreme Court's decision. In case you're not familiar with this process because you're a normal person, here's what this columnist wrote on Twitter. Quote, if you double-click where it says JJ at the top, then copy and paste it, that line reads Sotomayor J, concurring in part and dissenting in part. And if you do a Control-F search for Sotomayor J, concurring in part and dissenting in part, it highlights that same line. In other words, if you highlight some arbitrary portion of the opinion, you'll find some evidence in the metadata that previously, before this opinion was published, Sonia Sotomayor may have written a dissenting opinion instead of joining the 9-0 final majority opinion. And this is a discovery that could mean a clerk made a minor mistake somewhere and then corrected it before publishing, which would not be a remotely interesting development. It could also mean that Sonia Sotomayor changed her mind at some point in the deliberations, which also would not really be an interesting development. But in any event, Slate and MSNBC found this to be a highly interesting development. So I want you to watch as the Slate columnist breathlessly informs viewers of his findings that he found deep in the metadata of the court's opinion. Watch.
Why did it read like a dissent?
Because it seems it originally was a dissent. After this opinion came down, I checked the metadata, and that separate opinion that was presented as a concurrence by Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson, that was originally styled as a partial dissent by Justice Sotomayor alone. At some point very late in the process, the court switched the words on the page to say that it was a concurrence in the judgment, no longer a partial dissent, and added Justices Kagan and Jackson. But that is not how it read in the metadata, and probably not how it read until the last minute.
Now, if you listen carefully to what the Slate guy is saying, you'll notice that he has no proof whatsoever for any of it. He doesn't actually know that this change in the opinion was made late in the process. He doesn't really know why the metadata says that Sotomayor was dissenting. It's just speculation. And the point of it is to avoid informing the viewers that actually all of the experts you've heard on MSNBC for the past 3 months have been lying to you. Not even Sonia Sotomayor or Ketanji Brown Jackson or Amy Coney Barrett agree with him. And that's the last thing they want you to think about. The New York Times also went into histrionics for the same reason. They published an op-ed claiming the Supreme Court had just erased part of the Constitution. They find it easier to make embarrassing emotional claims than to address in any way all of the BS they've been peddling about this case. For people who pretend to care so much about misinformation, it's pretty striking. The fact none of these media organizations is reflecting on this failure tells us a lot about what they're planning. Just like we saw during Russiagate, they're not going to acknowledge their mistakes. They're not going to give up on their goal of removing the leading presidential candidate from the ballot, all in the name of defending democracy, supposedly. Instead, their plan is to simply adapt and find new ways to undermine the will of tens of millions of American voters. And it's important to emphasize here that 4 justices, Sotomayor, Kagan, Ketanji Brown Jackson, and the supposedly conservative Amy Coney Barrett, tried their hardest to preserve this possibility in yesterday's ruling. They all suggested that while states can't bar Trump from the ballot, there might be a way for the federal government to do it without an act of Congress. Now, what does that mean exactly? That's not clear. Amy Coney Barrett won't tell us. Maybe soon enough we'll find out. Until then, Congressman Jamie Raskin of Maryland has made it very clear that Democrats will press forward with an effort to disqualify Trump using an act of Congress. In response to the Supreme Court's ruling, which held that only Congress rather than states can disqualify federal office holders for insurrection, Raskin went on television to announce that Democrats in Congress will indeed do everything they can to disqualify Donald Trump from the ballot. Watch.
I am working with a number of my colleagues, including Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Eric Swalwell, to revive legislation that we had to set up a process by which we could determine that someone who committed insurrection is disqualified by Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And the House of Representatives already impeached Donald Trump for participating in insurrection by inciting it. So the House has already pronounced upon that.
And by the way, this is an obvious conclusion, but you can tell just how uncertain they are in Joe Biden and his ability to get elected. Because the thing is, if they actually thought that Joe Biden could win the election on his own, they wouldn't be doing any of this. There'd be no reason to do any of it. In fact, they would much prefer. Now they know that it would be better for them in every way if Donald Trump if Joe Biden just beat Donald Trump. They didn't disqualify him; they just got beat. But they are not confident at all in Biden's ability to do that, which is why they're going to these increasingly extreme lengths. And this is the same threat the Democrats made after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. The thought of giving up never crosses their minds. The thought of allowing voters in each of the 50 states to make their own decisions, whether it's about abortion or presidential candidates, never crosses their minds. If you page through the Washington Post comment section, you'll see that very clearly. Millions of left-wing voters want Jamie Raskin to pass his bill and forcibly remove Donald Trump from the ballot. And they have some very high-level support. As the podcaster Comfortably Smug pointed out the other day, left-wing dark money groups like Fix the Court are focused on packing the court, and their former director now works for the Biden campaign. So you see how high up this goes. And what this means is that as deranged as Keith Olberman is, he's actually not an outlier on the left. He's popular among them because he's willing to say what they're thinking. He's the face of all their worst impulses and ideas. And they are so committed to winning, so committed to preventing you from voting, they truly don't care whether that face is drenched in urine or not. If you'd like to see what else I have to say, you can access my full show by going to dailywire.com or by going to the Matt Walsh Show Twitter page. Hope to see you there. Godspeed.